They called him Paper Soldier. And minutes later, a 4-star general stormed in. An old man walks into court for a traffic ticket. Frail, quiet, easy to dismiss. The judge scoffs. The bailiff mocks. They all think he's just another fake veteran, milking the system. But what they don't know is, this man once held off an entire army, alone. And the truth they buried is about to blow the roof off the courtroom. Because when the doors swing open and that general storms in, the past crashes into the present. Secrets long hidden, scars no one can explain, and a silence that holds more power than anyone expected. Who is this man they tried to humiliate? Why does the highest-ranking officer in the room call him the bravest soldier she's ever known? And what happens when the one they mocked turns out to be the most dangerous man in the room? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Clarence Wainwright sat quietly in the last row, his weathered hands folded neatly in his lap. Despite his 80 years and frail appearance, he maintained the straight-backed posture that had become second nature during his military service decades ago. The courthouse buzzed with the usual morning activity: lawyers shuffling papers, clerks typing away at computers, and defendants fidgeting nervously as they waited their turn. But Clarence remained still, a picture of patience and dignity despite the discomfort of his illness. At the front of the courtroom, the bailiff leaned against his podium, eyeing the elderly man with barely concealed disdain. "Get a load of this one," he muttered to a nearby clerk, jerking his head in Clarence's direction. "Another war hero here to play the veteran card, I bet." The clerk glanced up briefly, then returned to her paperwork with a dismissive shrug. The bailiff wasn't finished, though. "Paper Soldier?" he whispered loud enough for his colleagues to hear, drawing a few snickers. "Probably spent the war pushing pencils and now wants special treatment." If Clarence heard the comments, he gave no indication. His face remained impassive, eyes focused straight ahead, hands still folded carefully in his lap. The only movement was a slight tremor in his fingers, a tremor that had nothing to do with fear or anxiety, though none in the courtroom knew its true cause. Judge Harrison Blackwood swept into the courtroom with his usual air of imperious efficiency. His black robes billowed slightly as he climbed the steps to his bench, not bothering to acknowledge any of the waiting defendants. The judge's reputation for running a strict courtroom was well known, matched only by his barely concealed contempt for what he called excuse-making veterans. "First case," Judge Blackwood called out, already sounding impatient despite the early hour. His eyes barely skimmed the document in front of him. "Clarence Wainwright, minor traffic violation." Clarence rose slowly from his seat, using careful, measured movements. The bailiff smirked at his deliberate pace. "Today, if you please, Mr. Wainwright," he called out, earning another round of muffled laughter from the court staff. Making his way to the defendant's podium, Clarence stood with military precision, shoulders square, chin slightly raised, eyes forward. It was a stance ingrained through years of service, as natural to him as breathing, though to the scornful eyes of the courtroom, it seemed like an affectation. Judge Blackwood barely looked up from his papers. "Mr. Wainwright, you're charged with failure to come to a complete stop at a marked intersection. How do you plead?" "Your Honor," Clarence began, his voice quiet but clear. "I was on my way to a medical appointment at the VA hospital." "That's not what I asked," Judge Blackwood cut him off sharply. "How do you plead to the charge?" The bailiff's smirk grew wider as he watched the exchange, clearly enjoying what he perceived as another veteran being put in his place. He leaned over to whisper to another court officer. "Here comes the sob story about serving his country." But Clarence didn't launch into any stories or excuses. He simply stood there, straight and dignified, his scarred hands now resting lightly on the podium. The morning light caught the pattern of old shrapnel scars across his knuckles, a detail lost on everyone in the courtroom, too busy with their assumptions to notice such things. "Guilty, Your Honor," Clarence said simply. "I apologize for the violation." Judge Blackwood finally glanced up, slightly thrown off by the straightforward response. He had clearly been preparing for a lengthy excuse or plea for special consideration. His pen hovered over the citation form as he studied the elderly man before him with narrow eyes. The bailiff shifted his weight, disappointed at being denied the entertainment of watching another veteran being dressed down by the judge. But he couldn't resist adding under his breath, just loud enough for nearby staff to hear. Probably the most action he saw was in the mess hall. Through it all, Clarence maintained his quiet dignity. The tremor in his hands might have increased slightly, but his face remained composed, bearing the disrespect with the same steady resolve that had carried him through far worse situations that would have turned the smirking bailiff's blood to ice had he known the truth. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, highlighting the dust motes floating in the air and casting stark shadows across the courtroom. In that moment, the distance between appearance and reality had never been greater. A decorated hero standing humbly before those who judged him without knowledge, his true identity still hidden behind years of classified records and his own modest nature. Judge Blackwood glanced at the citation in front of him, drumming his fingers impatiently on the bench. "According to this report, Mr. Wainwright, you were observed traveling 45 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone at 9:15 in the morning on Oak Street." "Yes, Your Honor," Clarence replied softly. His voice carried clearly through the quiet courtroom, despite its gentle tone. "I was running late for my appointment at the Veterans Affairs Hospital. You see, I'm undergoing cancer Oh, yes, of course." Judge Blackwood's tone shifted, taking on a sharp edge that made several observers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Another veteran with another medical appointment." He drew out the word veteran like it left a bad taste in his mouth. The bailiff's smirk grew wider as he watched his boss gear up for what was clearly going to be one of his famous dressing downs. He leaned against the podium, crossing his arms to enjoy the show. "Do you know how many veterans come through my courtroom, Mr. Wainwright?" Judge Blackwood continued, his voice rising. "And do you know how many of them use their VA appointments as an excuse for breaking the law?" Clarence stood perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on the podium. The morning sunlight caught the slight tremor in his fingers, a side effect of his treatments that had nothing to do with the judge's intimidating manner. "I wasn't making an excuse, Your Honor," Clarence said quietly. "I was simply explaining the circumstances, the cancer treatments." "The circumstances?" Judge Blackwood's face flushed red. "The circumstances don't change the law, sir. Being a veteran doesn't give you special privileges to endanger other citizens." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Several attorneys waiting for their cases exchanged concerned glances. Even the court reporter paused in her typing, looking up with worried eyes at the judge's unusually hostile tone. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Clarence began, his voice remaining steady despite the judge's growing anger. "I admitted my guilt and accept whatever penalty the court deems appropriate. I merely wanted to provide context for my actions." "Context?" Judge Blackwood practically spat the word. "Let me provide some context for you, Mr. Wainwright. Every day, I see veterans parade through this courtroom, expecting special treatment because they once wore a uniform. They wave their service around like some kind of get-out-of-jail-free card." The bailiff nodded enthusiastically, clearly enjoying the spectacle. He shot another smirk at his colleagues, though some of them were now looking distinctly uncomfortable with the direction things had taken. "Your Honor," Clarence tried again, "I'm not asking for special—" "I'm not finished!" Judge Blackwood slammed his hand down on the bench. "You people think your service entitles you to break whatever laws you please. Well, let me tell you something. This is a court of law, not a Veterans Affairs office. Your military status means nothing here." The courtroom had grown deathly quiet. The only sound was the soft whir of the ceiling fans and the continued trembling of papers in Clarence's hands as he stood at the podium. His face remained composed, but something flickered in his eyes. Not fear or anger, but a deep sadness at the prejudice being displayed. "I understand, Your Honor," Clarence said softly. "As I said, I accept responsibility for my actions. The cancer treatments have been difficult, and I miscalculated the time needed to reach the hospital. It won't happen again." But Judge Blackwood wasn't satisfied. His face had grown even redder, and his voice took on a mocking tone. "Oh yes, the cancer treatments. Another convenient excuse. Do you have any proof of these supposed treatments? Any documentation of this appointment you were so desperate to reach?" Clarence slowly reached into his jacket pocket with trembling fingers, pulling out a folded paper. "Yes, Your Honor. This is my appointment schedule from the oncology department." The bailiff stepped forward to take the paper, making a show of handling it with exaggerated skepticism before delivering it to the judge. Judge Blackwood barely glanced at it before tossing it aside. "Well, isn't that convenient?" he sneered. "A piece of paper that proves nothing except that you know how to work the system, just like every other veteran who comes through here expecting sympathy and special treatment." Several attorneys in the gallery were now openly shaking their heads. One even started gathering his papers, as if preparing to make a formal objection to the judge's behavior. The court clerk had stopped pretending to work and was staring at the scene with undisguised concern. Through it all, Clarence maintained his dignified bearing, standing straight despite his frail appearance. The tremor in his hands had grown more pronounced, but his voice remained steady as he addressed the court one more time. "Your Honor, I apologize if I've given you the impression that I'm seeking special treatment. That was never my intent. I simply believe in being honest about my circumstances, whether they're viewed as excuses or not." Judge Blackwood's face twisted into a scowl, clearly frustrated by Clarence's continued composure in the face of his hostility. The old man's quiet dignity seemed to fuel the judge's prejudice even further, like calm water feeding a storm. Judge Blackwood's face contorted with barely contained fury as he leaned forward over his bench. His knuckles turned white where they gripped the edge of the wooden surface. The morning sunlight, streaming through the high windows, seemed to highlight the angry flush spreading across his features. "Let me tell you something about veterans like you," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "I've spent 15 years on this bench watching your kind parade through my courtroom. Every single day it's the same story. Another so-called hero expecting special treatment because they once wore a uniform." The gallery had fallen completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and quiet whispers had ceased. The only sound was the judge's voice, growing louder with each passing moment. "You fake veterans are all the same," Blackwood continued, jabbing his finger toward Clarence. "You milk the system for every penny you can get, always waving around your service like it's some kind of golden ticket. Well, I'm sick of it." Clarence stood perfectly still at the podium, his weathered hands now steady as they rested on its surface. His face remained composed, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes as he watched the judge's tirade unfold. "Your Honor, Clarence began softly, but Blackwood cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "I'm not finished," the judge thundered. "Do you know what I see when I look at you? I see another supposed war hero trying to play on people's sympathies. Another veteran bleeding this country dry with exaggerated sob stories about service and sacrifice." The bailiff's earlier smirk had faded to an uncertain expression as he glanced between the judge and the elderly man. Several attorneys in the gallery were now frantically writing notes, their faces showing clear disapproval of the judge's behavior. "Every day it's the same thing," Blackwood continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "Oh, I have PTSD. Oh, I was wounded in combat. Oh, I need special consideration because I served. Well, I'm telling you right now, I don't care if you claim you stormed the beaches of Normandy itself. In this courtroom, your military service means nothing." A young law clerk in the front row gasped audibly at the judge's words, quickly covering her mouth with her hand. The court reporter's fingers had stopped moving across her keyboard, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You veterans think you're special," Blackwood sneered, his words cutting through the stunned silence. You walk around with your military medals and your war stories, expecting the world to bow at your feet. But I see through it. I see through all of you." Clarence remained motionless, his dignified bearing a stark contrast to the judge's increasing loss of control. His eyes, clear and steady, never left Blackwood's face as the tirade continued. "How many of you actually saw combat?" the judge demanded rhetorically, his voice rising to a near shout. "How many of your precious medals were earned pushing papers at a desk somewhere? You come in here with your exaggerated claims of heroism, thinking it gives you the right to break whatever laws you please." The prejudice in Blackwood's words was now unmistakable, revealing a deep-seated resentment that clearly went far beyond this simple traffic violation. His face had grown almost purple with rage, spittle flying from his lips as he continued his verbal assault. "I've had enough of your kind using military service as a shield," he snarled, "playing on people's patriotic sympathies while you drain resources from those who really need them. You're nothing but parasites wearing uniforms." Several people in the gallery had begun to stand, unable to sit quietly through this unprecedented display of judicial bias. A senior attorney near the back was already reaching for his phone, his expression grim as he watched the scene unfold. "Your cancer treatments?" Blackwood mocked, gesturing at the discarded medical documents. "Probably just another scam to get taxpayer-funded healthcare. Your military service? Likely exaggerated like all the rest. You veterans are all the same, living off the government while spinning tales about your heroic sacrifices." The courtroom atmosphere had grown thick with tension. The morning sun that had earlier filled the room with warm light now seemed harsh and revealing, highlighting every twist of hatred on the judge's face, every line of quiet dignity on Clarence's. "I see right through your sob stories," Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "All these claims about defending freedom and democracy, they're just covers for your real agenda. You're nothing but opportunists, feeding off the sympathy of people who actually believe your exaggerated tales of heroism." Throughout this entire outburst, Clarence remained standing straight, his bearing still carrying that subtle military edge despite his advanced age. His face showed no anger, no outrage at the judge's accusations, only a profound sadness at witnessing such deep-seated prejudice from a person in authority. The moral conflict hanging in the air was palpable. On one side stood Judge Blackwood, a man whose position demanded respect, but whose words revealed a shocking bias against veterans. On the other stood Clarence, quietly dignified in the face of this onslaught, embodying the very honor and sacrifice the judge so viciously denied. The echo of Judge Blackwood's hateful words hung in the air like poison. Clarence stood at the podium, his weathered hands beginning to tremble, not from fear or weakness, but from the tremendous effort of containing the fury building inside him. Decades of military discipline were all that kept his composure intact as he faced this blatant injustice. Judge Blackwood noticed the trembling and misread it completely. A smug smile crossed his face as he interpreted it as a sign of intimidation working. He straightened in his chair, puffing up with renewed confidence. "Well, Mr. Wainwright," Blackwood drawled, savoring what he thought was his moment of triumph. "Since you seem to think your veteran status puts you above the law, perhaps it's time for a lesson in respect." He paused for dramatic effect, clearly enjoying the power he wielded. 30 days in the county jail should help adjust your attitude." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even the bailiff, who had been smirking earlier, looked uncomfortable now. 30 days in jail for a simple traffic violation was unprecedented, a clear abuse of judicial power that crossed every line of fairness and propriety. "Your Honor," a public defender in the gallery started to protest, rising to his feet. "That sentence is completely—" "Silence!" Blackwood thundered, slamming his gavel down. "One more word and you'll be joining him for contempt." The public defender sank back into his seat, but his face showed pure disgust. Several other attorneys were furiously scribbling notes, their expressions a mixture of shock and outrage. The young law clerk who had gasped earlier was now openly crying, trying to muffle her sobs with her hand. Clarence slowly pushed himself to his feet. The movement was deliberate, controlled, and suddenly something about him changed. The frail elderly man seemed to fade away, replaced by something else entirely. His spine straightened with military precision, shoulders squaring despite the weight of his 80 years. The trembling in his hands ceased completely as they came to rest at his sides, exactly as regulations prescribed. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Heads turned throughout the gallery as people sensed the shift. The bailiff's hand unconsciously moved closer to his weapon, responding to some primal instinct that warned him something dangerous had just awakened. Judge Blackwood's smug expression faltered slightly as he watched Clarence rise. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. The elderly man before him no longer appeared weak or vulnerable. There was something in his bearing now, something in the way he held himself, that spoke of power carefully contained. The tension in the courtroom grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Every person present held their breath, waiting to see how this elderly veteran would respond to such a flagrant abuse of power. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to dim, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Clarence's eyes, clear and sharp as steel, fixed on Judge Blackwood. They were no longer the eyes of a tired old man. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things that would haunt lesser men's nightmares. Someone who had made decisions that would break weaker souls. Someone who had held the line when everything depended on it. The silence stretched out, becoming almost unbearable. Even Judge Blackwood seemed frozen, his gavel half raised, caught in the intensity of Clarence's gaze. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of this unspoken challenge. The old veteran's presence filled the courtroom now, though he hadn't moved an inch. His combat scars, usually hidden beneath his modest clothing, seemed to make themselves known somehow, especially the distinctive shrapnel pattern that marked him as someone who had faced death and emerged victorious. The air crackled with unspoken tension as everyone waited for Clarence's response. Would this be the moment when justice finally confronted prejudice? When true service faced down false authority? When real sacrifice met empty power? The answer hung in the balance as Clarence drew himself up to his full height, every inch the warrior he had always been, preparing to address the court. Just as Clarence opened his mouth to speak, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom burst open with a thunderous bang that made everyone jump. The sound echoed through the chamber like a cannon shot, drawing every eye toward the entrance. There, framed in the doorway, stood a figure that commanded instant respect. 4-star General Patricia Hawthorne stood tall in her immaculate dress uniform, ribbons and medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her eyes blazed with an intensity that could melt steel. The bailiff, who moments ago had been smirking at Clarence's predicament, stumbled forward with his hand raised. "Ma'am, you can't just," he began, his voice cracking. "There are protocols for entering a courtroom in session." General Hawthorne turned those steel-melting eyes on him. Just one look. That was all it took. The bailiff's words died in his throat as he withered under her gaze. His hand dropped limply to his side, and he took an involuntary step backward. The click of her polished dress shoes against the marble floor echoed through the silent courtroom as she strode forward. Her every movement spoke of authority earned through decades of command. This wasn't the practiced importance of a bureaucrat. This was the natural presence of someone used to making life-and-death decisions. Judge Blackwood's face, which had been flushed with anger moments before, now drained of color. His hands gripped the edges of his bench as he watched General Hawthorne approach. Gone was his earlier swagger, replaced by the uncertain look of a man who suddenly realized he might be in over his head. The atmosphere in the courtroom transformed completely. The bureaucratic tedium of traffic court vanished, replaced by electric tension. Even the morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to sharpen, highlighting the stars on General Hawthorne's shoulders. Court officers stood straighter. Attorneys stopped shuffling papers. The young law clerk who had been crying earlier now stared with wide-eyed wonder. Everyone could sense that something momentous was about to happen. General Hawthorne's measured steps carried her past the gallery, past the defendant's table where Clarence stood, and right up to the bench. She stopped precisely at the perfect distance for formal address, her posture parade ground perfect. "Judge Harrison Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and commanding. It wasn't particularly loud, but it filled every corner of the courtroom. "I understand you're having some difficulty showing proper respect to one of our nation's heroes." Blackwood tried to rally his authority. "Now see here," he began, his voice wavering slightly. "This is my courtroom, and—" "Your courtroom?" General Hawthorne's eyebrow arched slightly. "Tell me, Judge Blackwood, have you ever had to hold a position while being outnumbered 20-1? Have you ever had to make decisions that would determine whether hundreds of young men and women lived or died?" She didn't wait for his response. "No, you haven't, but he has." She gestured toward Clarence without taking her eyes off the judge. "That paper soldier your bailiff was mocking earlier? That man held Hill 947 for 18 hours straight, saving an entire battalion, my battalion, when I was just a young lieutenant." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The bailiff's face had gone as white as his knuckles where they gripped his belt. "But of course, you wouldn't know that," General Hawthorne continued, her voice taking on an edge of contempt. "Most of his record is still classified. 15 years of covert operations that helped shape the world we live in today. Missions that will never be declassified because they're still too sensitive to discuss." Judge Blackwood swallowed hard. His earlier confidence had completely evaporated, leaving him looking small and foolish behind his bench. The power dynamic in the courtroom had shifted completely. His authority now seemed hollow compared to the real authority standing before him. He started, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. "That Medal of Honor on his wall at home." General Hawthorne pressed on. "He earned it saving 38 lives, including mine. And you sit there in your air-conditioned courtroom and dare to question his service? Dare to sentence him to jail for trying to get to his cancer treatment?" The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the usual shuffle of papers and whispered conversations had ceased. Every person present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when true service confronted false authority, when real sacrifice met empty power. The transformation in the courtroom was complete. What had started as a routine traffic hearing had become something else entirely, a confrontation between genuine heroism and petty tyranny. And everyone present knew which side was winning. General Hawthorne came to a stop directly in front of the bench. Her presence filled the courtroom like a gathering storm. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of command. "Judge Blackwood," she said, each word precise and measured, "do you have any idea who you just sentenced to 30 days in jail?" The judge shifted in his seat, trying to project authority despite the tremor in his hands. He straightened his robes and cleared his throat. "General, while I respect your rank, this is my courtroom. The defendant's alleged military service has no bearing on—" "Alleged?" General Hawthorne's voice could have frozen fire. "Did you just say alleged, Your Honor?" Blackwood's face flushed. He gripped his gavel tighter, his knuckles turning white. "I treat all defendants equally in my courtroom, General. Military record or not, the law applies the same to everyone. I've seen too many veterans come through here expecting special treatment because of their supposed service." The general took another step forward, her eyes locked on Blackwood's face. The judge couldn't look away, caught like a rabbit in the gaze of a hawk. The tension in the courtroom grew so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Master Sergeant Clarence Wainwright," General Hawthorne announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room. "Medal of Honor recipient?" A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, who had been hovering uncertainly near his post, stumbled backward until he hit the wall. Judge Blackwood's face went from red to ash white in an instant. "That's impossible," he whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Impossible?" General Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. The same Master Sergeant Wainwright who held Hill 947 alone for 18 hours, saving an entire battalion? The man who received the nation's highest military decoration from the president himself? Every head in the courtroom turned to look at Clarence, who sat quietly in his chair, his weathered hands folded in his lap. His expression remained calm, but there was a glint of something in his eyes now. Not pride, but quiet dignity. I had no way of knowing," Judge Blackwood stammered, his earlier arrogance evaporating like morning dew. "No way of knowing?" General Hawthorne's voice cut through his excuses like a blade. "You had every way of knowing. His military ID was right there in front of you. But you were too busy making assumptions, weren't you? Too occupied with your prejudices to even look at the man you were judging." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the usual shuffling of papers and creaking of chairs had ceased. Everyone watched as the judge seemed to shrink behind his bench, his authority dissolving under General Hawthorne's steady gaze. "Master Sergeant Wainwright isn't just any veteran," she continued, her voice carrying an edge of controlled anger. "He's a man who sacrificed more for this country than most people could imagine. While you sit here in your comfortable chair, passing judgment on men and women you know nothing about, he was out there saving lives, fighting battles that still can't be discussed to this day." Judge Blackwood's hands trembled as he reached for his water glass. He knocked it over, sending water spilling across his desk. Nobody moved to help him clean it up. "The Medal of Honor," General Hawthorne pressed on, "is not some trinket handed out at parades, Your Honor. It's the highest recognition our nation can bestow, and you just sentenced its recipient to jail for trying to make it to his cancer treatment on time." The magnitude of Blackwood's error hung in the air like a physical presence. The same courtroom observers who had witnessed his earlier tirade now stared at him with open disapproval. The bailiff had pressed himself so far against the wall, he looked like he was trying to disappear into it. Through it all, Clarence sat quietly, his military bearing evident in his straight spine and steady gaze. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone, now that his true identity was known, spoke volumes about the kind of man he was. The contrast between his quiet dignity and Blackwood's crumbling facade couldn't have been starker. Judge Blackwood opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in his career, he found himself completely at a loss for words. The power dynamic in his courtroom had shifted so dramatically that his usual authority felt like a distant memory. The revelation of Clarence's Medal of Honor status hung in the air, transforming what had started as a routine traffic violation into something far more significant. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for Judge Blackwood, but for everyone who had witnessed his earlier display of prejudice and contempt. General Hawthorne's voice softened slightly, taking on an almost reverent tone as she continued. The entire courtroom leaned forward, hanging on her every word. "Hill 947, she said, her eyes distant with memory. March 15, 1968. Master Sergeant Wainwright was leading a reconnaissance patrol when his unit encountered heavy enemy forces. The rest of his team was critically wounded in the initial ambush." She gestured toward Clarence, who sat perfectly still, his weathered hands clasped in his lap. Instead of retreating, he single-handedly held that strategic position. For 18 hours straight, he defended that hill against wave after wave of enemy attacks. The intelligence he'd gathered showed that 3 enemy battalions were preparing to ambush the main American force in the valley below. His actions that day saved over 800 American lives. Judge Blackwood's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his bench. The same man he'd just berated as a fraud had saved nearly 1,000 soldiers. The bailiff, who had mockingly whispered "paper soldier" earlier, now couldn't even look in Clarence's direction. Using captured enemy weapons when his ammunition ran out, General Hawthorne continued, he held off multiple assaults. Despite taking shrapnel wounds to his torso, scars he carries to this day, he maintained his position. He used darkness and terrain to create the illusion of a larger force, even managing to call in precise artillery strikes while under constant fire. She paused, her voice growing even more solemn. The citation for his Medal of Honor notes that he eliminated 78 enemy combatants during those 18 hours. But what's not in the public record, Your Honor, is that he also captured vital intelligence documents from enemy officers during one of their attacks. Information that saved countless more American lives in the months that followed. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the usual shuffling of papers had ceased. Through it all, Clarence maintained his quiet dignity, neither proud nor ashamed, simply present. When reinforcements finally arrived, General Hawthorne said, they found him still manning his position, despite losing nearly 40% of his blood volume. The medics said they'd never seen anyone remain conscious with injuries that severe, let alone continue fighting. She turned to face the gallery, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. After Vietnam, Master Sergeant Wainwright spent 15 years conducting classified operations throughout Southeast Asia. The details of those missions remain sealed for national security reasons. But I can tell you this. There are thousands of American soldiers alive today because of his actions. Soldiers who never even knew his name. Judge Blackwood's face had lost all color. His earlier characterization of Clarence as someone bleeding the country dry now stood in stark contrast to the reality of a man who had literally bled to save his fellow soldiers. I know these details, General Hawthorne said, turning back to face the judge, because I was there on Hill 947. I was a young lieutenant with the relief force that arrived the next morning. I saw with my own eyes what one man's courage could accomplish. The enemy dead surrounding his position. The classified documents he'd secured. The way he refused medical evacuation until he'd briefed command about enemy positions that could threaten other units. She stepped closer to the bench, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper that somehow carried through the silent courtroom. So, when you sit there and accuse this man of exaggerating his service, of being a fake veteran who's milking the system, you're not just displaying your own prejudice, Your Honor. You're dishonoring one of the finest soldiers this nation has ever produced. The contrast between Judge Blackwood's earlier tirade and the reality of Clarence's service hung in the air like a physical presence. The judge's hands shook as he reached for his water glass, knocking it over in his nervousness. Water spread across his desk, soaking into papers he no longer seemed to care about. Through it all, Clarence remained composed, his military bearing evident in his straight spine and steady gaze. The tremor in his hands, which Blackwood had earlier mistaken for fear, now took on a different meaning. They were the hands that had held Hill 947, that had saved hundreds of lives, that still carried the scars of his sacrifice. The gallery watched in stunned silence as the full scope of Judge Blackwood's error became clear. He had taken one of America's greatest heroes, a man who had given everything short of his life for his country, and treated him like a common criminal. The judge's earlier accusations about veterans bleeding the country dry now rang with painful irony in light of how much blood Clarence had actually shed in service to his nation. The story of Hill 947 hung in the air, transforming the courtroom's atmosphere from one of bureaucratic routine to hallowed ground. Every person present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just the revelation of a hero's identity, but the collapse of prejudice in the face of undeniable truth. General Hawthorne's revelation about Hill 947 had stunned the courtroom, but she wasn't finished. Her eyes narrowed as she turned back to Judge Blackwood, who was still trying to compose himself after knocking over his water glass. "What you see in the public record, Your Honor, is deliberately misleading," she said, her voice carrying authority that made everyone lean forward. After Vietnam, Master Sergeant Wainwright's service record was intentionally obscured. What appeared to be a transfer to routine supply duties was actually a cover for something far more crucial to national security. The bailiff, who had earlier mocked Clarence as a paper soldier, shifted uncomfortably. His face reddened as he realized how catastrophically wrong his assessment had been. For 15 years after Vietnam, General Hawthorne continued, Master Sergeant Wainwright conducted highly classified intelligence operations throughout Southeast Asia. The details of these missions remain sealed to this day. The seemingly bland transfer papers and ordinary assignments were carefully crafted fiction, designed to hide his real work from our enemies. Clarence sat quietly, his scarred hands folded in his lap. His face remained impassive, neither confirming nor denying these revelations. It was the same expression he had worn when the bailiff had whispered insults, when Judge Blackwood had questioned his integrity, the face of a man who had learned decades ago to keep secrets. "This is why," General Hawthorne explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Anyone looking at his public record might question his service. It was designed that way. Every boring assignment, every mundane transfer, all carefully constructed cover stories to protect one of our most valuable intelligence assets." Judge Blackwood's earlier confidence had completely evaporated. He looked at Clarence with new eyes, finally seeing beyond the elderly man's frail appearance to glimpse the warrior beneath. "Those 15 years, General Hawthorne said. Master Sergeant Wainwright operated in conditions so dangerous that most of his missions are still classified. The intelligence he gathered saved countless American lives. The operations he conducted helped prevent conflicts that could have escalated into full-scale wars." She reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "I have here, Your Honor, a letter from the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, authorizing me to confirm these facts without revealing classified details. A letter I obtained within 30 minutes of hearing about this morning's proceedings." The paper trembled slightly in Judge Blackwood's hands as he read it. His face grew even paler. "The reason Master Sergeant Wainwright's record appears questionable to those without proper clearance," General Hawthorne continued, "is because it was meant to appear that way. Every medal he earned during those 15 years is recorded under different operations, different names, different locations. His true service record is scattered across dozens of classified files, deliberately separated to protect ongoing operations and sources that remain sensitive even today." The courtroom remained silent, absorbing the magnitude of what they were hearing. The contrast between appearance and reality was staggering. The elderly man who had been accused of exaggerating his service had actually been forced to hide the true extent of his heroism. "So when you look at his public record," General Hawthorne said, her voice cutting through the silence, "you see what we wanted people to see. A decorated Vietnam veteran who transferred to routine duties. The perfect cover for a man who was actually conducting some of the most dangerous and crucial intelligence operations of the Cold War." She turned to address the gallery directly. "This is why Master Sergeant Wainwright never defended himself against accusations, never corrected those who questioned his service. He understood that maintaining his cover was more important than his reputation. He accepted the whispers, the doubts, the insults, because that's what his country asked of him." The bailiff's earlier whisper of paper soldier now took on a completely different meaning. The very fact that someone could question Clarence's service was proof of how well that service had been hidden. "Even today," General Hawthorne said, turning back to the judge, "he carries scars from missions that officially never happened, bears wounds from battles that don't exist in any public record, and he does so without complaint, without seeking recognition, without expecting anything in return." Clarence remained stoic throughout these revelations, his military bearing unchanged. The same quiet dignity that had been interpreted as weakness now revealed itself as the disciplined composure of a man who had spent decades guarding vital secrets. Judge Blackwood looked down at his wet desk, where the spilled water had soaked through papers that now seemed trivially unimportant. His earlier accusations about veterans milking the system stood exposed as not just prejudiced, but completely backwards. Here was a man who had hidden his true service at great personal cost, accepting disrespect and doubt rather than revealing classified information. The transformation of understanding in the courtroom was palpable. Every previous interaction took on new meaning. Clarence's quiet responses to accusations, his controlled reaction to insults, his dignified bearing in the face of disrespect, all of it appeared now as evidence of extraordinary character rather than signs of guilt or weakness. The paper soldier had turned out to be one of America's most accomplished hidden warriors, and the very documents that had raised questions about his service were proof of how vital that service had been. Judge Blackwood gripped the edges of his bench, his knuckles turning white. The evidence of Clarence's heroic service lay before him: the Joint Chief's letter, General Hawthorne's testimony, the classified records she'd referenced. Yet something in him refused to yield. "This is my courtroom," he declared, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "I won't be swayed by elaborate performances or convenient letters that suddenly appear." General Hawthorne's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Your Honor, these are official military documents. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Anyone can fabricate documents." Blackwood cut her off, his face flushing red. "Anyone can put on a uniform and make grand claims. I've seen it all before, veterans trying to intimidate their way out of consequences." The gallery erupted in shocked whispers. Even the court reporter paused, her fingers frozen above her keyboard as she stared at the judge in disbelief. "Are you suggesting," General Hawthorne said slowly, each word precise and deadly, "that I, a 4-star general, have fabricated military documents and committed fraud? That the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is part of some conspiracy to help a man avoid a traffic ticket?" Blackwood's jaw clenched. He knew he was walking a dangerous line, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. His reputation, his authority, everything he'd built over his career, seemed to hang in the balance. "I'm suggesting that this courtroom operates on facts, not theatrics," he said. "And the fact is that Mr. Wainwright violated traffic laws and showed contempt for this court. The sentence stands. 30 days. Clarence remained seated, his weathered hands still folded calmly in his lap. The same hands that had held Hill 947, that had carried out classified missions for 15 years, now rested quietly as another battle unfolded around him. "General Hawthorne," Blackwood continued, his voice rising, "I'm ordering you to leave my courtroom. Your presence here is disruptive and inappropriate." The bailiff, who had been shrinking further into himself with each revelation, looked uncertainly between the judge and the general. The command to remove her died in his throat as she fixed him with a steel-melting glare. "Your Honor," General Hawthorne's voice cut through the tension like a blade, "you're making a serious mistake, one that goes far beyond professional misconduct." "Is that a threat, General?" Blackwood's voice cracked slightly, betraying his nervousness despite his defiant words. "That's a fact," she replied. "You have irrefutable evidence before you that Master Sergeant Wainwright is one of this nation's most decorated heroes. You have proof that his service record was deliberately obscured for national security reasons, yet you choose to persist in this farce." Blackwood shuffled papers on his desk, trying to project authority he no longer felt. "The evidence you've presented is irrelevant to the charges. The law applies equally to everyone, decorated veteran or not." "The law does apply equally," General Hawthorne agreed, her voice sharp. "Which is why judges aren't supposed to hand out 30-day sentences for minor traffic violations based on personal prejudice against veterans." The truth of her words hung heavy in the air. Everyone in the courtroom knew that Blackwood's sentence was grossly disproportionate, motivated by bias rather than justice. "I won't be intimidated in my own courtroom," Blackwood insisted, though his voice had lost its earlier thunder. "This is about maintaining order and respect for the law." "No," General Hawthorne corrected him. "This is about your pride. Your inability to admit you made a terrible mistake. Your refusal to acknowledge that you've spent years allowing your prejudice against veterans to corrupt your judgment from that bench." Blackwood's face reddened further. "General Hawthorne, I'm warning you." "You're warning me?" She took a step closer to the bench. "While you sit there continuing to disrespect a Medal of Honor recipient, while you ignore official military documents and accuse decorated officers of fraud, while you abuse your authority to pursue a personal vendetta against veterans?" The courtroom had grown deathly quiet. Every person present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, a judge's authority crumbling under the weight of his own hubris. This case, Blackwood tried one last time, his voice weaker now, is about a simple traffic violation, nothing more. This case, General Hawthorne corrected, has become about something far more serious. It's about judicial misconduct, abuse of authority, and discrimination against veterans. And your continued refusal to acknowledge these facts only makes it worse. Still, incredibly, Blackwood shook his head. The sentence stands, he insisted, though his words rang hollow in the silent courtroom. I won't be swayed by these theatrics. His repeated use of the word theatrics drew looks of disgust from the gallery. The evidence before him was anything but theatrical. It was official, documented, verified at the highest levels. His refusal to acknowledge it spoke volumes about his character. The confrontation had reached a breaking point. Judge Blackwood, despite being presented with undeniable proof of his error, had chosen to entrench himself deeper in his prejudice. His pride had completely overridden his judgment, transforming what could have been a moment of correction into a display of judicial corruption. The tension in Judge Blackwood's courtroom had reached a breaking point. Without saying a word, Clarence slowly rose from his seat. His movements were deliberate, carrying the weight of years of service and sacrifice. The room fell silent as he began to unbutton his shirt with trembling fingers. "Master Sergeant," General Hawthorne said softly, understanding in her eyes, "you don't have to." But Clarence continued, his weathered hands working each button with quiet determination. As he removed his shirt, gasps echoed through the courtroom. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his torso, illuminating a map of sacrifice etched into his flesh. Fresh surgical scars from his recent cancer treatments crossed his chest, angry red lines that spoke of his current battles. But it was the older marks that drew every eye in the room. Decades-old combat wounds told stories of violence and valor that no one could deny. The bailiff who had mockingly whispered "paper soldier" earlier took an involuntary step backward. His face drained of color as he stared at the physical evidence of service that no one could fake. Most prominent among the scars was a distinctive pattern spread across Clarence's right side, a spiderweb of marks that could only come from one source. General Hawthorne's breath caught as she recognized it immediately. "The shrapnel pattern from Hill 947, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "I was there. I saw him take that hit. He kept fighting for 18 hours after that wound, holding the position that saved our entire battalion." Judge Blackwood's face had gone ashen. He gripped his desk, knuckles white, as the undeniable truth stood before him. These weren't marks that could be fabricated or exaggerated. Each scar told its own story of service, sacrifice, and survival. "Your Honor," General Hawthorne continued, her voice hard with controlled anger, "these are the same wounds documented in Master Sergeant Wainwright's classified medical records, the same distinctive pattern noted by field medics during the Battle of Hill 947, the same scars that earned him the Medal of Honor." Clarence stood quietly, his bare torso a testament to both past glory and present struggle. The surgical scars from his cancer treatment were a stark reminder of why he had been rushing to the Veterans Affairs Hospital that morning. The simple truth that had started this entire confrontation. "Those recent surgical marks," General Hawthorne pointed out, "confirm exactly what Master Sergeant Wainwright told you at the beginning of this hearing. He was speeding because he needed to reach his cancer treatment appointment. A truth you chose to mock and dismiss." The gallery watched in stunned silence. Court officers, lawyers, and observers who had witnessed countless cases in this room had never seen anything like this moment. The physical evidence of both heroic service and current medical struggles stood before them, impossible to deny or dismiss. One of the court clerks dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The court reporter's hands trembled above her keyboard. Even the usually stoic bailiff looked away, shame evident on his face. "I've seen these wounds before," General Hawthorne said, her voice softer now but still carrying to every corner of the room. "I was a young lieutenant when Master Sergeant Wainwright saved our entire unit. The medal citation doesn't begin to capture what he did that day. what he endured, what he sacrificed. Clarence remained standing, straight-backed despite his age and frailty. His scars told the story that his humble nature never would, of battles fought, of wounds endured, of a lifetime given in service to his country. The fresh surgical scars spoke of a different kind of battle, one fought in hospital rooms rather than on hillsides. They validated his original explanation about rushing to treatment, making Judge Blackwood's earlier skepticism seem not just unfair, but cruel. These marks, General Hawthorne gestured to the distinctive shrapnel pattern, are as unique as a fingerprint. They match exactly with the combat photography and medical records from that day. This isn't something that can be faked or exaggerated, Your Honor. This is the physical evidence of sacrifice and service that you chose to dismiss. The courtroom remained absolutely silent, the impact of this moment settling over everyone present. Here was truth that couldn't be argued away or dismissed with accusations of theatrics. Here was evidence that no amount of judicial authority could deny. Judge Blackwood stared at the scars before him, both the old wounds of war and the fresh marks of ongoing battles. His earlier bravado had evaporated in the face of such undeniable proof. The physical testament of service and sacrifice stood before him, challenging every assumption he had made, every prejudice he had acted upon. The shrapnel pattern that General Hawthorne had recognized told its own story, one that matched perfectly with the classified records she had referenced. It was a mark of identity, as clear as any document, a physical signature of that historic battle that had saved so many lives. Judge Blackwood's face twisted with rage as he slammed his gavel down. "Bailiffs, arrest this man immediately for contempt of court!" His voice cracked with desperation, a man clinging to the last threads of his authority. Two court officers moved toward Clarence, their hands reaching for their handcuffs. The elderly veteran stood quietly, still shirtless, his scarred torso a testament to battles long past. But something changed in his stance, subtle shifts that only General Hawthorne recognized from her combat experience. "I wouldn't do that," she warned, but the bailiffs ignored her. The first officer grabbed Clarence's arm roughly. What happened next seemed impossible for an 80-year-old cancer patient. Clarence's weathered hands moved with lightning precision, his fingers finding pressure points that most martial artists spent years mastering. In one fluid motion, he twisted the bailiff's arm, relieving him of his handcuffs while sending him stumbling backward. The second bailiff lunged forward. Clarence stepped aside with remarkable grace, using the officer's own momentum to guide him into a stumble. The movements were precise, economic, nothing flashy or theatrical. These were the practiced techniques of someone who had spent decades in combat situations where efficiency meant survival. "Stand down!" General Hawthorne barked, but more officers were already rushing forward. Clarence backed himself into a defensive position against the courtroom wall. His stance shifted subtly, and suddenly the frail old man disappeared. In his place stood a warrior whose muscle memory had been honed through countless life-or-death encounters. His hands remained steady now, the earlier trembling gone. His eyes scanned the room continuously, tracking multiple threats with the practiced ease of a combat veteran. Gasps and cries filled the courtroom as spectators scrambled to get out of the way. The court reporter ducked behind her stenograph machine. The remaining bailiffs spread out, trying to surround Clarence, but his positioning against the wall had eliminated that tactical option. "He's just an old man," one of the younger officers said, moving forward confidently. Clarence's response was immediate and decisive. As the officer reached for him, Clarence executed a perfect joint lock, redirecting the young man's energy and dropping him to his knees with minimal effort. The move was so smooth, so professionally executed, that several observers didn't even realize what had happened until the officer was already down. "That's enough!" General Hawthorne's voice cut through the chaos. "Look at him. Really, look. Those aren't the moves of some fake veteran. That's decades of specialized combat training you're witnessing." The remaining bailiffs hesitated, finally recognizing the lethal efficiency in Clarence's movements. Despite his age and illness, his combat skills remained razor-sharp. His breathing was controlled, his stance perfect, the muscle memory of countless covert operations still intact. "Stand down immediately," General Hawthorne commanded the bailiffs, "unless you want to explain why you attacked a Medal of Honor recipient in open court." But Judge Blackwood, his face now purple with rage, wouldn't relent. "I gave you an order! Arrest him!" Two more officers moved forward uncertainly. Clarence responded with a series of defensive blocks that seemed to flow like water, each movement precise and measured. He wasn't attacking, merely preventing anyone from laying hands on him. But even these defensive maneuvers demonstrated a level of skill that couldn't be faked. "Look at his form," General Hawthorne said loudly, making sure everyone in the courtroom understood what they were witnessing. "Those are classified combat techniques, moves that were only taught to our most elite operatives. You can't learn that from watching movies or playing soldier." The standoff continued, with Clarence maintaining his defensive position. His military bearing was now unmistakable, the perfect balance, the controlled breathing, the economical movements that spoke of years of specialized training. Despite his cancer, despite his age, his body remembered every lesson learned in decades of combat. "This is what a real warrior looks like," General Hawthorne announced, her voice filled with quiet pride. "Not someone playing dress-up, not someone faking service. You're watching decades of the highest level of military training this country has to offer." The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. More officers gathered at the doorway, drawn by the commotion, but none seemed eager to test Clarence's abilities further. The first bailiffs he had disabled were still recovering, their professional pride as bruised as their bodies. Clarence remained silent throughout, letting his actions speak for him. Every movement, every stance, every perfectly executed defensive technique proved what General Hawthorne had been saying. This was no paper soldier. This was a highly trained combat veteran whose skills had been honed in real battles and covert operations. The standoff threatened to escalate further as more officers arrived, but Clarence's calm efficiency gave them pause. His eyes tracked every movement in the room. His hands remained steady, his breathing controlled. Despite being surrounded, despite his age and illness, he showed no fear, only the practiced readiness of someone who had faced far worse situations and survived. General Hawthorne moved swiftly, positioning herself between Clarence and the advancing bailiffs. Her uniform gleamed under the fluorescent lights as she spread her arms wide, creating a human barrier. "Everyone stay exactly where you are," she commanded, her voice carrying the weight of decades of military authority. The bailiffs hesitated, caught between Judge Blackwood's orders and the unmistakable command presence of a 4-star general. "This has gone far enough," she continued, keeping her eyes on the officers while speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I won't allow this situation to escalate further." Clarence remained in his defensive stance, his breathing steady, but his eyes showed recognition at the general's familiar tone of authority. She turned slightly, keeping both him and the bailiffs in her field of vision. "Master Sergeant Wainwright," she addressed him formally, "stand down. I've got your 6. Something in her voice, some shared understanding, made Clarence's posture relax slightly. He didn't drop his guard entirely, but his stance shifted from combat-ready to alert waiting. "Your Honor," General Hawthorne turned to face Judge Blackwood, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "There's something else you need to understand about Hill 947. Something that isn't in any of the official records." The judge's face remained flushed with anger, but curiosity flickered in his eyes. The courtroom fell silent, sensing another revelation coming. "I know exactly what happened on that hill because I was there," she said, her voice growing thick with emotion. "I was a young lieutenant, fresh out of officer training, when our unit got pinned down by enemy fire." Her words carried across the hushed courtroom as she continued. "We were surrounded, taking heavy casualties. I had a bullet in my leg and couldn't walk. The enemy was closing in, and we were running out of ammunition." Clarence's expression softened as the general spoke, old memories clearly playing across his weathered features. She turned to look at him directly, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. That's when Master Sergeant Wainwright found us. He had already been wounded twice, but he refused to leave anyone behind. Her voice wavered slightly. He carried me on his back while providing covering fire. For 18 hours, he moved back and forth across that hillside, getting wounded soldiers to safety while holding off the enemy. Judge Blackwood's anger had begun to fade, replaced by uncertainty as he watched the interaction between the decorated general and the elderly veteran. When we ran out of ammunition, General Hawthorne continued, he fought them hand to hand. The same skills you just witnessed in this courtroom kept us alive that night. He used enemy weapons, improvised explosives, anything he could find. By morning, he had single-handedly evacuated 23 wounded soldiers and held off an entire enemy battalion. She stepped closer to Clarence, her eyes glistening. I was the first one he saved that night. I was certain I was going to die on that hill, but he wouldn't let that happen. He told me to keep fighting, to never give up. Those words stayed with me through 30 years of service. The bailiffs had lowered their hands, many of them now standing at parade rest, instinctively responding to the military bearing of both Clarence and the general. The tension in the room had transformed into something else, a shared witness to a powerful moment of recognition and respect. "Everything I've accomplished in my military career," General Hawthorne said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "Every rank I've earned, every soldier I've led, it all started that night on Hill 947, because Master Sergeant Wainwright believed in me enough to risk his life carrying a wounded lieutenant to safety." She turned to face Judge Blackwood directly. "So when you talk about fake veterans and paper soldiers, you're not just disrespecting him. You're disrespecting every life he saved, every soldier he inspired, every mission he completed that will never appear in any public record." Clarence stood straighter, his defensive posture completely relaxed now. The connection between him and the general was palpable. The bond between a young lieutenant and the sergeant who had saved her life, forged in combat and strengthened by years of shared service. "I'm not here just as a superior officer," General Hawthorne declared. "I'm here as someone who owes her life to this man, someone who has spent 30 years trying to live up to the example he set that night. And I will not stand by while he is disrespected in this or any other courtroom." The atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed completely. The bailiffs who had been ready to attack Clarence moments before now looked at him with new understanding. The spectators who had witnessed his defensive display now saw it in a different light, not as the actions of a defiant old man, but as the ingrained skills of a hero who had saved countless lives. General Hawthorne's personal connection to Clarence had changed everything. This wasn't just about military records or medals anymore. It was about the deep bonds forged in combat, about lives saved and sacrifices made, about the ripple effects of one soldier's courage touching countless other lives through the years. General Hawthorne stood tall in the center of the courtroom, her presence commanding everyone's attention. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the stars on her uniform as she continued her testimony. "Your Honor, Master Sergeant Wainwright's impact goes far beyond that one night, on Hill 947, she said, her voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of service. "His example has shaped every decision I've made throughout my military career." She began to pace slowly, her polished boots clicking against the courtroom floor. "When I recovered from my wounds, I could have taken a safe desk assignment. Many suggested I should, but I remembered how Sergeant Wainwright refused to leave anyone behind, how he put others before himself. That inspired me to push harder, to serve where I was needed most." The general pulled out a thick folder from her briefcase and approached the bench. "I have here Master Sergeant Wainwright's complete service record, including his classified operations. These documents required presidential authorization to declassify." She placed the folder before Judge Blackwood. "They detail not only his Medal of Honor action, but 15 years of covert operations that saved countless American lives." Judge Blackwood's hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder. His face paled as he began reading the contents. "But there's something else you need to see, Your Honor." General Hawthorne produced another set of documents. "These are complaints filed against your court over the past 5 years. 37 cases where veterans faced unusually harsh sentences for minor infractions. 23 instances where their service-related medical appointments were dismissed as excuses." The judge's face grew even paler as she continued. Staff Sergeant Mariah Rodriguez, fined $1,000 for parking in a handicap space while attending her PTSD therapy. Corporal James Chen, 3 days in jail for being 5 minutes late to a hearing because his prosthetic leg malfunctioned. Lieutenant Sarah Peterson, denied a continuance despite showing orders for emergency deployment. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom as the pattern of bias became clear. The bailiff who had mocked Clarence earlier now stood uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "Each of these veterans served honorably," General Hawthorne continued, her voice growing stern. "Each one faced disproportionate punishment in your courtroom. This isn't about one traffic violation or one elderly veteran. This is about systematic prejudice against the men and women who've served this country." She turned to address the whole courtroom. "When I made general, I promised myself I would lead the way Sergeant Wainwright led, with courage, compassion, and unwavering dedication to those under my command. His example taught me that true leadership means standing up against injustice, no matter where you find it." Clarence stood quietly, his weathered face showing a mix of pride and humility as General Hawthorne spoke. The contrast between his modest demeanor and his extraordinary service record made her words even more powerful. "The night he saved us on that hill, Sergeant Wainwright didn't ask about our ranks, our backgrounds, or our politics. He risked his life for every soldier equally. That's the standard I've tried to uphold throughout my career." She faced Judge Blackwood directly. "And that's the standard our justice system should uphold." The general produced one final document. "This is a formal complaint to the Judicial Review Board documenting the pattern of discriminatory sentencing in your courtroom. It includes statements from dozens of veterans who've appeared before you, statistical analysis of your sentencing patterns, and expert testimony on judicial bias." Judge Blackwood's face had lost all its previous arrogance. He looked from the document to Clarence, then back to General Hawthorne, seemingly at a loss for words. "Master Sergeant Wainwright's case ends here," she declared firmly. "His traffic citation will be dismissed, and he will be escorted to his medical appointment at the VA hospital. But this larger issue, this pattern of disrespect and discrimination against veterans, that ends today as well." She turned to Clarence with deep respect. "Your example, Sergeant, taught me to never back down when fighting for what's right. It taught me that one person standing up against injustice can inspire others to do the same. Your actions on Hill 947 saved more than just lives. They created a legacy of leadership and courage that continues to this day." The courtroom had fallen completely silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The documentation of Judge Blackwood's bias lay exposed on his bench, as undeniable as the combat scars on Clarence's body. The system of prejudice that had allowed veterans to be mistreated in this courtroom was finally being brought to light, all because one elderly veteran's quiet dignity had inspired a general to take a stand. General Hawthorne stood at attention and saluted Clarence. "Thank you, Master Sergeant, not just for saving my life that night, but for showing all of us, what true service and sacrifice look like. Your example has guided my entire career, and today, it helps us ensure justice for every veteran who enters this courtroom." The aftermath of General Hawthorne's revelation swept through the courthouse like wildfire. Judge Harrison Blackwood sat frozen behind his bench, his authority crumbling as reporters began flooding into the courtroom. News cameras captured the moment as judicial officers entered, officially suspending him pending an immediate investigation. "Judge Harrison Blackwood," announced the senior judicial officer, "you are hereby suspended from the bench, effective immediately. A full review of your cases involving veterans will commence this afternoon." Blackwood's face, already pale, turned ashen as photographers' flashes illuminated the courtroom. The same bailiff who had whispered, "Paper soldier," now stood at attention, his earlier mockery replaced by visible shame as Clarence's true identity became public knowledge. Outside the courthouse, television crews jostled for position as Clarence emerged with General Hawthorne at his side. His quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to the media frenzy. Local stations interrupted their regular programming to broadcast live as the story of the Medal of Honor recipient, who had been nearly jailed for a minor traffic violation, spread across the nation. Master Sergeant Wainwright's treatment in that courtroom was a disgrace, General Hawthorne declared to the assembled press. But it exposed a system of bias that needed to be brought to light. Today, justice has been served not just for him, but for all veterans who faced discrimination in Judge Blackwood's court. The response from the military community was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans began sharing their own stories of mistreatment in Blackwood's courtroom on social media. Within hours, a local Veterans of Foreign Wars post organized a motorcycle escort to ensure Clarence made it to his cancer treatment appointment at the VA hospital on time. Inside the VA hospital's waiting room, Clarence sat quietly while General Hawthorne made calls on his behalf. His weathered hands remained steady as he filled out paperwork, maintaining the same composure he had shown throughout the morning's events. "Master Sergeant," General Hawthorne said, putting down her phone, "the Secretary of Veterans Affairs himself just assured me that your treatment will be fully covered. A special medical fund is being established in your name to ensure you receive the best possible care." Clarence looked up, his eyes showing a hint of emotion for the first time that day. "Ma'am, that's not necessary. I never wanted special treatment." "This isn't special treatment, Sergeant," she replied firmly. "This is the nation finally giving you the recognition you earned decades ago. Your story has inspired others to step forward. Veterans who suffered in silence are speaking up. Judge Blackwood's bias affected hundreds of lives, and now those wrongs can begin to be made right." News coverage continued throughout the day. Judge Blackwood's career imploded as investigators uncovered more evidence of his systematic discrimination against veterans. His previous rulings were being reviewed, and veterans who had faced unjust sentences were coming forward with their stories. By evening, Clarence's oncology appointment complete, he and General Hawthorne sat in the hospital's small cafeteria. Despite the day's chaos, they found a quiet moment to talk about Hill 947 and the years that followed. "I've thought about that night so many times," General Hawthorne admitted, stirring her coffee. "How you never gave up, even when we were completely surrounded. I've tried to lead with that same determination throughout my career." Clarence nodded slowly. "You've done well, Lieutenant." He smiled slightly, using her old rank. "Though I suppose I should say General now." "You can call me Patricia," she replied warmly. "After all these years, I think we've earned first-name basis." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several high-ranking military officials. Word of Clarence's presence had spread through the Pentagon, and those who knew his classified history came to pay their respects. The cafeteria filled with uniforms as current and retired service members arrived to honor the quiet hero in their midst. A young Marine captain approached their table, standing at attention. "Master Sergeant Wainwright, sir. My grandfather served in your battalion. He told me stories about Hill 947. I never knew if they were true until today." Clarence's response was characteristically humble. "We all did our duty that day, son. Every single one of us." As evening turned to night, the impromptu gathering transformed into an informal celebration of Clarence's service. Veterans from different eras shared stories, finding common ground in their experiences. The hospital staff, moved by the outpouring of respect, kept the cafeteria open late to accommodate the growing crowd. General Hawthorne watched as Clarence, despite his fatigue from the day's events and his treatment, took time to speak with each person who approached him. His quiet strength and dignity, the same qualities that had saved her life decades ago, remained unchanged. "You know," she said when they finally had another moment alone, "this is long overdue. You spent years in the shadows because your missions were classified. You never sought recognition for your sacrifices. But sometimes recognition finds you anyway. Clarence looked around at the gathering of service members, his eyes reflecting decades of memories. I never needed recognition, he said softly. Just respect for all who served. Maybe some good will come from today. Maybe other veterans won't face what I faced in that courtroom. General Hawthorne reached across the table and squeezed his hand. They won't, she assured him. Judge Blackwood's career is over. His bias has been exposed. And more importantly, your example has reminded everyone what true service and sacrifice look like. The evening ended with plans made for future meetings. General Hawthorne would oversee Clarence's ongoing medical care personally, ensuring he received the treatment he needed. Their shared experience on Hill 947 had forged a bond decades ago, and now that bond would continue as a friendship built on mutual respect and understanding. As Clarence prepared to leave, supported by an honor guard of veterans who insisted on escorting him home, he turned to General Hawthorne one last time. "Thank you, Patricia," he said simply. "Not for today, but for carrying forward what we fought for all those years ago." She saluted him, her eyes bright with emotion. "No, Master Sergeant. Thank you for showing us all what it truly means to serve." Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.